For analysis on what this means for people across Ontario, let's bring in Jessica Smith Cross. She's the editor-in-chief at the Trillium, and John Michael McGrath, a co-host of the onpoli podcast right here at TVO. Great to have you both.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, we just heard from Auditor General Spence about the specifics of her report. What should Ontarians, though, be paying attention to here? Jessica, let me start with you.
If you're going to your doctor and talking about your medical issues, your doctor might be using an AI Scribe. They're going to tell you about that. But what you should be paying attention to is that the AI Scribes can make mistakes. That was the big finding from this report. For me, it became really clear why this is important to people when the AG herself, at this press conference she had at Queen's Park, told everybody that she had this scratchy voice because she was sick. She'd been to the doctor. Her doctor was using an AI Scribe, and she asked her doctor, okay, can you look over the transcript afterwards and make sure it's right? Because I just did this report and I've got some concerns. So I think that's what people should take away from this. Like if your doctor's using one of these things, maybe have a conversation with them and say do you check it over after? Is it accurate? What's going on?
Yeah, because it's out there. It's in the healthcare system in different settings, and it's being used right now. John, what stood out to you about the report?
I think the use of AI in healthcare is sort of the camel's nose in the tent, if I can put it that way. We're going to see more ways that AI and AI-supported services get used throughout the public sector in years to come. And it's important that this is done right, that these systems are tested. And the AG's report does stress that these services were tested through the procurement process, right? The government didn't just sign a check to whoever showed up.
Sure.
But her warning was that while not every service failed in the same way, they all had weaknesses that we had to be aware of. And right now, it's important that we obviously get this information correct in a healthcare setting. You obviously don't want the doctor accidentally prescribing the wrong medication. That could be very serious. But it's also, a kind of an entry-level problem that we're letting AI solve in the sense that this should be something it is good at and it will get better at. But as Jessica said, this is something that I think, anybody out there who is interfacing with the healthcare system, you do want to be aware of this and really emphasize that your doctor should be taking care.
The report on the procurement process felt very critical to me. As political journalists, put that in perspective for me, John.
Yeah, the government obviously goes through, I'm sure it's hundreds of major procurements every year, and this was one that they really they highlighted. It's not every day that the government sends out press releases for a procurement announcement, but they did for this one back when it was first announced. And this is all part of the government trying to, get more efficiency out of the healthcare system. Obviously, healthcare, the single biggest item in the budget. So for any government, it is important that those dollars be spent well. But, as you say in this report, a lot of questions about whether the government was adequately testing the procurement process. And I don't think the auditor said this, but I think there's a fair question to ask about, whether the government was so enthusiastic about the potential for AI that maybe it wasn't testing these services as rigorously as public confidence might have required.
Sure, not as many checks and balances. Were you surprised by the problems in the process?
That was really interesting to me because as a journalist, we don't often really get to see too much about what goes on behind the scenes with procurement issues. So the AG was able to shine a light on that here. And what I found really interesting about it was that the government prioritized the fact that these AI Scribes were made in Ontario over the accuracy by a long shot, by the way they weighted what was important for the procurement. It's a political issue that is going to land in your doctor's office. The government needed something to solve their problems about not having enough family doctors. Mm-hmm. That's why they put out a press release. Mm-hmm. That's why they made a big deal when these things came in, because they were facing a lot of heat about not having enough family doctors. So they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. This is going to free up your doctor's time so they can see more patients and have more appointments. That does seem to be true. The doctors that use them say they love them and they are saving them time. But through this report, we see how this political problem of a shortage of doctors and this need to have things made and built in Ontario, which is the PC's whole theme has made its way into what AI Scribe your doctor's going to be using when you come in to have a checkup.
Jessica, did Supply Ontario mishandle this process?
I'm not here to judge things like that. I'm here to provide some analysis. Like, they made a choice. They prioritized the made in Ontario over the accuracy, and that was the choice that they made.
But there was a lot of recommendations in there, and recommendations that the government was also saying, yes, we need to improve. What can they do better, John?
Well, I think one question that we, as a province, are going to need to wrestle with is exactly this issue of, how important is it to Ontarians that the AI service that we interface with through the government, or that the government procures on our behalf, is that a made in Ontario or even a made in Canada solution? Because I don't think I'm being unfair here to say that Canada is not at the very forefront of the AI race, right? The best models are still in the US and controlled by US companies. And there's a real tension there between, do we want to have access or to use the best possible AI systems, or do we want something where we have a bit more control over something that is resident in and domiciled in Canada and particularly in Ontario?
AI hallucinations or incomplete information from AI, that's not something that's new. I mean, we deal with it all the time, even when we look things up. It feels different when it comes to healthcare. Should we be worried?
I think that it depends. So I've seen my doctor use the AI Scribe when I come in for checkups. I like my doctor. I trust my doctor. I am not overly worried. I think she probably does check the transcript that is sent out there. I haven't seen any problems. And I'm also, I'm an outspoken person. I'm an advocate for myself. I know what's going on.
Sure.
But this isn't the case for everybody, right? There are people who are more vulnerable, who aren't able to advocate for themselves in the same kind of way. And there are people who bounce between like walk-in clinics and ERs and stuff like that, who I think are at more risk from having someone who's rushed, who would miss a hallucination and then have that cause problems down the road.
John, doesn't that put extra pressure on doctors to get it right? Because the scribe is just transcribing, whether it gets it right or wrong.
Yeah, and in fact, the government has said, it's still up to doctors at the end of the day to make sure that the transcription is accurate. This is supposed to be a tool, but it's not supposed to be a crutch. The other thing I would add, we're talking about healthcare because of the specifics of this Auditor General report, but that's the number one expense for the province. The number two is education, and there's a lot of talk right now about the next wave will be AI tutoring services in education, and the same labor shortage that we have with family doctors also exists in classrooms, right? We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough educational assistants. And there is going to be a lot of pressure to, not just in Canada, but certainly here, to find ways to use AI in the classroom to either to supplement or potentially even replace some of the labor there.
Every sector dealing with it. We all have to figure out a better way forward. Should there be a threshold in your mind, though, of what percentage is accurate when we are saying, yes, AI can go into the public system?
In some realms, it has to be everything. Like we do journalism. Some journalists use AI to help them in research. We've seen some really high-profile, really embarrassing corrections from other news outlets, not mine, thank you very much, about where that has gone wrong. I think that if you're a journalist and you've used AI, you have to have also manually checked it, whatever it is, in another way. I would say the same threshold should apply in medicine and in a lot of important careers where accuracy is important.
So do you think that threshold was too low here, John?
Well, the threshold to me would be we should at least be comparing it to all of the errors that humans make already, right? The human system is not perfect, right? And I think of like Waymo cars in the cities where they have been used seem to have a much better safety record than human drivers on a per mile traveled basis. Certainly, journalists were making errors long before AI ever came around.
Sure.
There, but for the grace of God, go I. So I would say the threshold should be certainly no less than whatever the human threshold for error is, and hopefully substantially better. But I would not insist on perfection, at least not everywhere.
Yeah, I would insist that the AI doesn't make mistakes. I would insist that the human who uses the AI makes sure its mistakes don't survive or go on into the patient's medical records, into the news story, into whatever it is.
Right, which is what I think this technology relies on still, is that a human doctor is going to come in and correct those errors. But it is employed, and we have to see, I guess, how it's working. Great to have both your perspectives on the show today. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having us.